Welcome to Grappling with the Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making. Help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guest today. With me is Krista Crawford, who is a human resource consultant, adjunct instructor at Virginia Tech and Champlain College, and group chair with Vistage Worldwide Incorporated. Sarah Kalmeta, also known as Sarah the Pivoter, is a speaker, author, and relentless truth seeker, which is why she's here. She is founder of Pivot Point International, a high-performance consulting company. And Jolanta Pomiotlo is Vice President of Information Technology at EXIF Worldwide, who manages innovative initiatives aimed at reducing operating costs, improving profit, and growing revenue. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And here is our challenge for today. While in Missouri, we are having thunderstorms and tornado warnings, so we'll hope that Zoom continues functioning. But here we go. Paul Whelan, a 55-year-old retired U.S. Marine, was freed from Russia last summer after being imprisoned on false espionage charges for more than 5 years. After the first year of his detention, his employer cut his job and his insurance coverage. When he finally arrived home, Mr. Whelan found that he did not qualify for unemployment because he had not worked in Michigan recently. A member of Congress had to contact Michigan's Secretary of State just for Mr. Whelan to get a driver's license and identification. And being convicted of a crime in Russia, even a crime the U.S. government declared was bogus, hindered his getting a global entry card because he was arrested and imprisoned overseas. Apparently, Customs and Border Patrol didn't have access to the pictures of the President of the United States meeting him at Andrews Air Force Base when he came back. Strangest of all, when Mr. Whelan tried to get full Medicaid coverage through the state, he received a letter back saying that he didn't qualify because he wasn't a U.S. citizen. And his story is not unique. NPR seemed to miss the irony when they aired this story on March 27th, scarcely 2 minutes before a story questioning why the Department of Government Efficiency needs access to citizens' private data and personal information. Ostensibly, DOJ is charged with scouring government records for signs of waste, fraud, and abuse, not to mention inefficiency. Might Paul Whelan reasonably argue that protecting our data is slightly less urgent than ensuring the government agencies make better use of the data to serve U.S. citizens? There's always going to be a tension between protecting personal freedoms and providing for the general welfare. Is it possible to balance one against the other without descending into partisan politics? The floor is open.
Well, I think it's really a juicy topic, be really technical. You always have this tension when you're trying to work with security and privacy and trying to find where that intersection meets and how to balance it. And without going into what I think it's really hard to put yourself in the shoes of Paul Whelan and speak about it. So it's a little easier to speak about it in terms of general terms. But when we put a person to it, it changes it. And isn't that what ethics is really about? It's about the human interaction and the human realization.
Yeah, that really is something that comes up in so many instances. When we talk about ideas in the abstract, we can be very confident in the judgments that we're making. But as soon as it gets personal, it's a whole different story.
The other thing about tension is that tension is healthy for us to be able to grow. And without that tension, status quo remains. And it's this, an object in motion stays in motion, an object at rest stays at rest. So we will always have a tension no matter what policy or what direction we move towards, because mindsets, attitudes, environment will all shift. The ideas around privacy for someone of the baby boomer generation versus a Gen Z generation are entirely different. And something that would scare a baby boomer into hiding or feel really violated is something that Gen Z does without a moment's hesitation. And so it's understanding that and understanding like where is this technology taking us? What's the benefit? How do we counteract the cybersecurity risk? And so, it's important to have the healthy dialogue amongst all the perspectives without clinging to, an old version or an old mental model, while also giving ourselves the opportunity to explore some new ways of being. And so that's not really an answer of how do we solve for it, but it is important that we have the dialogues and that we're not just having dialogue at executive C-suite level where people are of a certain age group or generation, and we're not having it, at only the technological level either, because then we remove the human element completely, and we need to bridge the gap rather than create silos.
It's really interesting the way you just framed that, Sarah, because I thought you were going to go in kind of the opposite direction. Um, I'm a boomer, and I know that I feel, and I think many of my contemporaries feel that, I'm not doing anything of which I'm profoundly embarrassed, and therefore I'm not that worried about people peeking into some of my data. And whereas my son and daughter-in-law, who are millennials, they don't put any pictures of their baby online. They're very concerned about Big Brother. And then this is coming, from me, who's thinks that 1984 is the most important book written in the last century. But it's just the way, you came at it from one angle. My intuition was the opposite, and that's just another example of how different people look at the same things in different ways.
Absolutely. And I have friends who are millennials and they have babies. They do the same thing. However, they're not concerned about Big Brother. They're concerned about AI generation and their child's face being used for things like child pornography or sex trafficking.
Right.
And so they don't want that out there. Also, there is now this viewpoint that, I believe it was the baby on the Nirvana album cover, went back and sued for being naked on that album cover without consent. Consent was not a large part of the conversation in many areas for a long time. And now we have new levels of awareness, and that is very much the conversation of today. But also, you pointed out millennials, not Gen Z. I mean, Gen Z puts everything they do online, so they're a little bit less concerned. That might shift once they have children, right? And then, we millennials still grew up in an era where they played outside rather than being on a phone because they didn't have phones. They didn't have the internet, or it took 10 minutes to get dial up to work. And all you could do was chat with your friends. And a website, it took too long. So we did other things to entertain ourselves. But again, same people, same generation, different generations, we will all have a different perspective based on our own unique experiences.
Yeah, and I'll kind of throw in a technology lens on top of the scenario, because I was thinking, as a technology professional, I was thinking, is the fact that the data wasn't so shared between the different agencies, because the government's capturing the data, so it belongs to the government entity, right, around this gentleman. Is the issue maybe outdated legacy systems that aren't properly stitched together, that are not sharing data, or is the issue truly data privacy, right? I do think we have privacy challenges in this country. If you look at, you're in public and people are taking pictures, like think of us as a celebrity, right? You're a celebrity, you're in public at Starbucks, people are taking pictures and they're selling that picture to tabloids and it's all over newspapers. Like, we have kind of very backwards privacy policies as a country. We give away a lot of our privacy rights in different agreements and on social media. So I almost feel like that's a meaty topic to dive into as a discussion too. But this gentleman in particular, though, I almost feel like he's just a product of a very stitched together technology ecosystem where data sharing isn't so efficient.
Is he a product or is he the lone victim? Like how often?
Yeah, I would
That's,
say a victim of it. Yeah.
yeah, I was curious how often this scenario may play out. We
Hmm.
heard about this one, but how often does this happen? Uh,
Yeah, well,
Not
part of the article said that he has had other people in similar situations reach out to him when they heard his story. that they wanted to connect with other people who were going through the same thing. So it was reported as not an isolated incident.
Hmm.
My HR background kind of kicked in. If you have employees who are visiting a foreign country, there's a whole repatriation process. One would think if you've been held in a prison in another country, that there would be services and there would be a system that would repatriate you, that there would be almost like the welcome wagon. Here are the services you are still capable of receiving. Here are the ones you should be, but right now there's a technicality where you can't. We're working on it. So I was really shocked that the article gives the impression that that didn't exist. Welcome back.
Mm-hmm.
Let us know how it works out. So repatriation is just a standard process for bringing employees who are overseas back to live in their home country.
That's a really interesting point because if a U.S. citizen has been wrongly imprisoned in this country, there's all kinds of reparations and even people who have been convicted as felons and legitimately so. There's still processes to help them transition back into society. So it is kind of surprising. It could be that situations like this are relatively rare, and therefore there just isn't an infrastructure designed to deal with it.
Yeah, that's a good point because it could just be the rarity of the scenario. Because if you think about it, it was a prison swap, right? I think they swapped prisoners when he
Right,
came back.
right.
So it was a deal, and I'm sure they're not doing these deals on a regular basis. It's just it was a very visible case. It was a very visible kind of unique scenario. But I did a little bit of like I Googled him and I kind of looked at a little bit of his background on Wikipedia and stuff. And he has a very interesting background though.
In what way?
Well, he was part of the Navy, so he served or in the Marines, but he was dishonorably discharged, right? For I think I forget what the reasons were, but it was a little bit related to theft or use. So, I also just look. He's just an interesting character. So,
Well,
at least
that's
I found his background very interesting.
yeah, and I always appreciate when my guests do more research than I do, because very often there are elements in the story that don't come out from a superficial
Right.
perusing of of the headlines or the way it's presented. And once you start filling in some of that information, you can often find that there may be factors that contribute to the story in a significant way that we just didn't know about.
Mhm.
I think also to your point, Yolanta, that when you have something that is not supported by a system because it's a one-off or because it's a very rare case, what you also get are people that are very used to a certain SOP, certain process and procedure that they're following. And when something new comes across their desk, it's like all systems go haywire and they don't have the competence or the maybe autonomy or perceived autonomy to make a decision. And so
Mhm.
even the most smart people or the most helpful people will be bottlenecked and not able to make a decision. So things get kind of pushed around, especially when you have a legacy system that's very bureaucratic with departments focusing on different things, or maybe they don't have the technology, so it takes forever because it's by paper, or that one person that has the authority to make a decision is, out of town for whatever reason and not available. And so these things take much longer than they conceivably should take based on what we can see on paper.
So
Yeah, and I'm
true.
gonna rein myself in because you just touched on one of the topics I really get into in my ethics presentations, which is creating a culture where employees feel that they're trusted and empowered and trained to make decisions in the moment, because very often even the best systems will fail at times, and you have to have a human being there who can make a call, and they have to be able to know that they're not going to get in trouble for trying to make a situation better. In one of my visage programs, I learned that from one of the members that the Ritz-Carlton apparently has a policy where they tell employees that they have access to $2,000 to make autonomous decisions to help customers. If if they need to, and rather than going through some chain of command that's not going to help the problem until the person's already checked out and gone. And I just love that, because what is the management saying to the employees? We
I trust
trust
you to
you.
make good decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, we trust your judgment, we trust your honesty, and we want you to be a partner with us in providing customer experience, because that's what we're all about. And just imagine what that does for the employee morale and self-esteem and sense of commitment and loyalty, and what it does for customer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That ties into self-determination theory. Having the perceived choice, like I have the ability to make a choice that affects something, and it's relatedness. Like what is my community? How am I being perceived by my employer, by the customer? And so this then ties into intrinsic motivation. And now your employees are not just loyal, but they're advocates for you. And they will go above and beyond because they're intrinsically motivated, knowing that they can make these decisions. It feels good. So they, do it again and again, rather than dangling the carrot or waving a stick. They will repeatedly go towards these behaviors. And then you're also creating a situation in which your guests are also becoming advocates, because you know that the only time you get feedback is if it's positive or negative. Really, really positive or very, very negative. So now they're going around saying, oh my gosh, this person, they did this thing, they didn't have to. And even though, it was terrible in the beginning, like, wow, what a recovery. And that kind of marketing you can't replace. And so how can we bring that into other systems like government, where, there are more regulation, there's control, there's different factors we have to consider. But can we design a matrix? I mean, I worked at a company where there was a matrix of decisions, and up to a certain dollar amount based on your level, you could make those decisions. Beyond that, you had to go get sign off from, the manager or the director or C-suite level. But this allowed for there to be some of that autonomy, as well as building up the decision-making skills of the team, rather than creating this bottleneck of always having to ask. So some of that is having the matrix. A lot of it is also training your leaders to actually know how to manage other humans, because most of the time we just say, hey, you're great at what you do. Here's a new title, and now you manage 5 other human beings. And that doesn't always go very well.
Taking your idea of a matrix, or at least some sort of plan or process, I want to go back to Paul, the human that we're talking about here in this circumstance. He was in another country, isolated, in fear, abandoned, the joy of coming home, and then once again, isolated, fear. He lost his benefits, he lost his job, he felt abandoned. Had there been a system and process where one of those people in one of those agencies said, wait a minute, this isn't making sense, we should talk to someone else. And I guess a congressperson got involved, but it doesn't sound like the wave of all the things that were impacted. It's like dominoes. When he lost everything, regardless of what his background was. He was a U.S. citizen who had been brought back, welcomed by a president of the United States, and then abandoned, in essence.
And it's almost, Krista, he's also lucky because he had the access to a highly visible politician to help, right? Because his case was very visible. Imagine if you're an individual that might not have all the media attention, or it isn't very mainstream or in the public eye. Imagine getting support to work through this system to get yourself situated and reimmersed into the society. Like, that would be very challenging, right? So he kind of was fortunate that it was a very visible situation.
The truth is that I think many of us don't realize that we all have access to our congresspeople and our senators. I had a friend in Israel. He was from Australia, and he married a woman from the United States, and they wanted to go back. They're planning to go back to visit her parents shortly after they were married. And he was getting a runaround from the American embassy
Mm.
in Israel, and just couldn't get a visa. And my wife actually came up with this idea. Um, the wife's father in the States called his congressman,
Uh,
and the problem got taken care of very quickly. We don't know often the resources that are available to us. We don't
true.
think in those terms, but really we shouldn't have to. The system should be there to serve us, and we shouldn't have to resort to these types of things. It was just you just put me in mind, Krista. Um, there's a TED Talk, I wish I could remember who gave it, but he was asking the question, why does there seem to be so much more um, PTSD uh, in military engagements? World War II was just as nasty as anything going on. Now, my wife's uncle was in Patton's army and was in the Battle of the Bulge. And for years after he came back, they had to have separate beds because he marched in his sleep all night long. The legs were just going because that was their life for years. And um, but there didn't seem to be that residual trauma that we're hearing about so much in more recent times. And his theory was that back then, vets came back from a war that had tremendous support into a society that was very structured and cohesive, and that people slotted back into their lives, and their friends and their neighbors and their support systems. Whereas now, society is so fractured and so fissured that people come back and they feel lost and they miss the camaraderie they had with their fellow soldiers. And what made me think of this is this story that we're talking about, where the system broke down on so many levels. When the system doesn't work for us, we lose faith in the system and we lose faith in the bigger system. And that makes us feel isolated and bitter and resentful and unfairly treated. And this, I think, contributes to a general sense of discontent that I think we can see at play in many different aspects of our culture.
Absolutely. We're having this conversation. I know you don't like to necessarily date conversations, but today, another agency, thousands of people lost their jobs today on their way to work. They got a text that their badges weren't going to work. And talk about loss of trust. And not only them, but their supervisors and the people that they would normally reach out to get support. Ultimately, I'm sure there will be information and there will be some forms of support and contact, but complete loss of trust in terms of your employer. And who is your employer? It's your government. It's the people that are employing you.
Yeah, and I mean, it's maddening because even if it's absolutely correct that these people should be, and then these jobs need to be, eliminated, and there's too much pork, and there's too much red tape, and there's too much bureaucracy. But there's a right way to do it,
Yes.
and that's not the way to do it. And
Mhm.
why is that so hard for people making the decisions to figure out?
Mhm. Yeah, and you see this all the time in the private sector, right? You've got companies that have RIFs and reduction in labor and layoffs, and there's companies that do it well, right? They communicate in advance, they provide good benefits, they provide severance, and then there's other companies that are like, you show up tomorrow and sorry, bye, grab your stuff, and it's over. So if there's good leadership, you will have a good process, and you'll have a very respectful trans.
Uh-oh.
IT gremlins.
Yeah. Well, the three of us are here, I guess.
I agree with what Jolanta is saying. It's, there's
Them just to say, pack up your stuff tomorrow. See you, bye.
Jolanta, we lost you for about 30 seconds there.
Oh, I apologize. I
Not your
apologize.
fault.
Yeah.
You want to sum up again on
Oh.
at the end of your point there?
Oh, I was just basically saying it's all about, the how if you've got good leadership, they will do it the right way, right? You could still downsize the corporations and reduce your labor, but you could do it the right way. Make sure that people are taken care of and you think about the human element of it.
Yeah, thanks. Yes. Sarah.
The human element is so critical, and to the point made before where, we don't have community. So many people don't have community and they feel so lonely. And we're online all the time, and yet we're more lonely than ever. And the blue zone areas of the world, why are they blue zones? It's not just the diet and the seaside and the sun. It's because they have community. There's a really great book called Lost Connections that dives into this. And that is where resilient cultures can also be built if, we are focused in having the right people on the right bus in the right seat, and we are building in the right structure and measures, making sure people are competent and trained and communicating well. Then we can remember that, it's not just about the bottom line. It's about making sure that there will be a bottom line for many years to come, right? And so that requires us to look at all the stakeholders, which include our vendors, which include our customers, our internal stakeholders, but also the environment, right? The fact that, the West focuses so much hyper individualistic is very much about like, now, I want it now. Whereas a lot of the Eastern culture and traditions, or maybe even if we look at indigenous culture and traditions, it really is about the entire tribe, and making sure that those things are taken care of. And when we start treating people like machines, they don't feel sovereignty. They're left alone, Krista, like you mentioned, feeling abandoned, and not even like anybody is caring, especially in a foreign environment like that. That is where we really start to fail, not just as leaders, and employers, but as the human race, in my opinion.
Can you
For sure.
translate blue zone, please?
Can I what? Sorry?
Translate blue zone.
Blue zone. So blue zone are these spots in the world, like there's in Japan, I think there's in like the Mediterranean, these spots around the globe where the lifespan of people is much longer than anywhere else. There's less issues of heart attacks or cancers or mental health problems. So people are living, well into the like first 10 years of the hundreds, and not having health complications. They're playing sports at 80, and they're, traveling at 90, and, hosting big family gatherings for 60 people at 98. So, it's a very different thing than what we often experience, in the West, where it's like, oh, I'm 70 and I'm on all these medications and I'm super stressed, or I dropped out of a heart attack because I've been running on adrenaline for 30 years because my employer has tried to milk out every single piece of productivity from me, and I have nothing left to give. Meanwhile, I don't have a relationship with my spouse or my kids. It's very not sustainable.
Hmm.
Talking about the blue zones, we see similarities in organizations. Gallup did a poll through 2023 and 2024, and we are at the lowest in terms of employee engagement over a 10-year period. The highs are there, but the lows are also there, and the gap between is really, really big. And then they dug into the data and they discovered that big keys to this are people feel like their bosses, their supervisors don't know them. There's this whole sense of not belonging, that they're not listened to, they're not heard. And we use the phrase, people want to be seen, heard, and appreciated. And that was showing up in this Gallup data. And it's coming up in all types of places, that human connection.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder, Krista, if the pandemic had, added to it, right? Because in a remote model or a hybrid model, we are very much isolated, right? You're not coming into the office, you don't have that sense of community, and it's a lot harder to build relationship virtually than it is if you just bump into somebody in the lunchroom and start a conversation. So I wonder if there's a component if the hybrid or the remote working model kind of feeds into that disconnection or that lack of connection.
Yeah, they looked into that, not as much as you would think.
No?
And there's also a generational difference between who can um, be happy in a virtual work environment and who
Yeah.
cannot. So there are ways to make it
Yeah.
where you're closer. And again, that takes someone who's designing a process and a program. And when you're doing training, you create these situations where people can engage.
Mhm.
And you ask a question. How do you like to be managed? How do you like to
Mm.
be communicated? And then you listen and you respond. It really isn't that hard if we stop and remember we're dealing with humans
Mhm.
and that we have a strong sense and need for connection. Some people more than others. I'm
Mhm.
definitely one who needs a lot of connection. So
You're a high I see, according to your Zoom
I
name.
am a very high I. Yes.
Oh.
And that's so important because when we know those things, we can then treat people how they want to be treated, which makes
Yes.
them feel seen and heard, which means they are more intrinsically motivated. And it's not this constant like battle of the wills or coercion or I'm going to pull you across the line. It's just, I understand how to engage with you because I know what's important for you and what you value. And yes, it's a label, and there are so many different models all out there. They all have the value, but really it's just ultimately taking the time to actually understand that because you might have two millennials, but they or want to be managed very differently or have different energy levels. I have people that say to me, Sarah, like, how can you get on a stage or go to a conference? Like, that is my worst nightmare. I don't want to be around people. Like, I just need to go home. I would die after one day. And meanwhile, I'm thriving there, but I still need my downtime, right? And it's just understanding those things. And sometimes it's the person doesn't know. So as the organization, if we want to stay in business or we want to make sure that we're building the right systems as we continue to evolve and grow, we're just doing iterations of it. We adapt and then we have those conversations and we help create the environment where those conversations can happen, where creativity can flourish. And then that gives us momentum to drive the business forward.
I think what could have happened, let's just imagine with Whelan coming back into the United States, maybe people ask him, let us know what we can do to help you. But there could have been an assumption that you were going to have unemployment insurance, you were going to have some type of health insurance, you were going to have some type of safety net that was going to take care of you. And by that point, you're no longer on the tarmac in DC, you're back home wherever you are, and you've got that sense of isolation again. Imagining here.
It is,
Mhm.
it is very jarring to come back from being on an outpost station like that. I mean, I was overseas for 13 years, and I've expressed this to Nasim before, but when I came back, that first 2 years, 2022 to 2024, I felt like I was 17 again, learning the world. Like, how does the health insurance work in this country? How do I, why is this? I file my taxes like this for my business in Hong Kong. What is this about over here? Why is it like this? It was a complete learning curve, and I felt like a fish out of water. And especially for someone who's, you've got 10, 20, 30, 40 years of experience, and you're then going back into a different environment where you're no longer just visiting, but you're reintegrating back into that system, that structure. There's a lot of reverse culture shock that's going to happen. And, it's tough to feel that newness again. So many people avoid feeling beginner energy. So they do the things that they're good at. They become experts. And by very virtue of becoming an expert, you are more likely to fail because you're only focused in this one area, right? And a lot of that is, a lot of times we're not tested. We're not needing to uh, kind of explore in those arenas. But it is extremely jarring to have to figure those things out. And especially when you have now this, it's a criminal offense and you're trying to fight that, but maybe you don't understand the legal landscape. You don't even know what to ask for in terms of help. That would be, terrifying, especially for someone who is by themselves and they don't have that community.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. And we move into a situation and we have a certain self-image as we've achieved, we've accomplished, we have competence. And now I find myself in a situation where I'm failing in the basics.
Mm.
Uh, that can really be, um, uh, you can really break a person down. make them feel extremely inadequate and vulnerable, and then perhaps not willing to ask for help because that just compounds the sense of vulnerability.
Mhm.
It comes to, often in these conversations, it comes to leadership, self-leadership, leader, lead thyself.
Mhm.
And when you are depleted, the ability to do that is lessened. And when you've, as Sarah was talking, when you've been out of your home base, you've lost your immediate network, you've lost your connections. I don't care how much family you have, you've missed a whole year or more of interaction. And being able to dig deep and get to that person, it may take a long time for that person to come back. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other element too is, coming out of a different, which is awesome, Sarah, that you have that perspective because you've done that, right? You moved from Hong Kong and back into the States, so it is a immersive and a culture shock. But what I think with this individual, he came from prison, right? And prisons are harsh, and
Russian
especially
person.
yes, especially Russian prisons and such. So I think there's definitely a need for empathy and kind of looking at like, wow, you come from a very difficult past 5 or X number of years, and now you're facing even more difficulties trying to get support and trying to get assimilated back into the U.S. And so he's probably very frustrated.
And talk about culture shock, like you mentioned,
Hmm.
prison experience
Yeah.
is a completely different world. And we can only hypothesize about what
Right.
that's possibly like. And, we see the movies, of course, but it is not an experience that many actually go through and understand. And so to then come from that and go back and be expected to just operate in the world as a normal citizen, it's very similar to, a soldier who's been in war. And it's just like, okay, yeah, now go shop at Walmart and go to the movies and everything's fine. Like there's a process that has to be there, and most people don't have the emotional toolkit to be able to process what they've been through. There's a lot of culture, norms around, having to go talk to someone if that's okay. In Australia, they actually relabeled PTSD as just PTS because there's no disorder with your brain or your
No.
body for having this reaction. It's your brain is actually doing what it's supposed to do to protect you in the moment. It's that you were in a hyper situation that created this reaction, and now it's about creating safety and getting back to a regulated state rather than being in this dysregulated state. But even that has helped them move that perceived, you know, I have to be fixed. There's something wrong with me. I broke because I wasn't strong enough.
Mhm.
Uh, and it's helping with that mental health conversation. And it's so small. Language matters. Language is
Yeah,
what.
yeah. Yeah, you reminded me of John McCain, who was in the Hanoi Hilton for several years, and while he was there, his wife had become apparently ill while he was gone, and when he came back, they were both different people. They didn't know each other. They couldn't pick up where they left off because things had changed so radically, and it wasn't anybody's fault. It was just the reality of the circumstance and the situation. And when governments send people into situations, I think there is at least an implicit responsibility that they're going to see them through, not just until they come back, but make sure they're okay in their return. And I think we can suggest that there might be a similar responsibility with businesses and employers as well.
That sense of duty of care.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sayings is kindness is underrated. There's nothing wrong with just some general kindness in the world.
Yes, absolutely.
I agree 100%.
Well, that might be a good place to wrap up this part of the conversation. certainly if we'd all focus on a little more kindness, we'd all be a lot better off. And trying to understand, right? And I often say that the E in ethics is empathy. Try to put ourselves in the situation of other people to try and feel and understand what they're going through. It returns that humanity that we've been talking about. And then kindness is going to become more of a reflex than something that we have to, remind ourselves is important. Oh, for those of you who are watching and listening, if you have a topic you'd like us to take up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com, use the contact information, submit your idea. If it's compelling, we'll definitely use it for a future episode. After we sign off here, the conversation continues, and premium members have access to those backstage conversations. You go to my Substack and see what's involved becoming a premium member. But for now, Krista Crawford, Sarah Kalmeta, Jolanta Pomiotlo, thank you all very much for a thoughtful, engaging, penetrating conversation. And until next time, encourage all of you to continue grappling with the gray.